You were taught a lie before you could even spell your own name. Be nice, be agreeable, don't make waves. Smile even when it costs you. And one day, if you are liked enough, the world will reward you. Nobody ever told you the truth. The world does not reward the liked. It quietly bleeds them dry. Somewhere in your life, right now, there's a version of you that says yes when the answer should be no. There's a version of you that smooths things over instead of standing firm. There's a version of you that would rather lose money than lose approval. That version has a name, the Courtier. 500 years ago, in the marble halls of Florence and the perfumed courts of Milan, men lived and died by one skill, not swordsmanship, not bloodline, the ability to be liked by the right people. They were called courtiers, and they were the most educated, most charming, most socially gifted men of their age. They complimented the prince's poetry. They laughed at his jokes before he finished telling them. They agreed with whatever he believed on Tuesday, even if it contradicted what he believed on Monday. And when the prince fell, when fortune turned, when a rival seized a throne, the courtiers were the first to be executed, not because they were disloyal, because they had built their entire existence on being liked by one man, instead of being useful, feared, or independent from him. When the wind changed, they had nothing to stand on. You are still doing this. You just do it with your landlord, your boss, your friends, your family, and your own bank account. This is not a video about confidence. This is not a video about being ruder to people. This is a diagnosis of the single most expensive addiction in the modern world. And I promise you, by the end of this, you will see it everywhere. In your last conversation, in your last purchase, in the raise you never asked for, in the loan you gave a friend you knew would never repay it. Being liked is not free. It has a price. And most people have been paying it their entire lives without ever reading the invoice. Think about the last time you felt a small flush of pride because someone called you easygoing, low maintenance. Such a pleasure to work with. It felt like a compliment. It was actually a market signal, and the market read it correctly. It heard, this one will not push back. This one will absorb the cost of my convenience. This one will smile for the underpayment, the late invoice, the favor that was never returned. You were not being praised. You were being priced. This pattern is not new, and it is not accidental. It is one of the oldest survival strategies a human being can adopt, because for most of history, being disliked by the group meant exile, and exile meant death. Your nervous system does not know the difference between a modern negotiation and a tribal expulsion. It reacts to both with the same ancient terror. That terror is not weakness. It is inheritance. But inheritance can be renegotiated. And that is exactly what the rest of this video will teach you to do. Niccolo Machiavelli spent years watching princes rise and fall, and he arrived at a conclusion that still makes people uncomfortable 5 centuries later. It is safer to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. Not because cruelty is virtuous, because love is fickle and fear is reliable. People break promises to those they merely like the moment it becomes convenient. Fear does not break so easily. Here is what almost nobody extracts from that idea. It was never really about kings and armies. It was about leverage. A prince who needed to be loved had already surrendered his position, because the moment his subjects' affection wavered, so did his power. A prince who commanded respect through competence and consequence did not need to beg for anyone's warmth. His position held itself up. Money works exactly the same way, and almost nobody tells you this, because it is unpleasant to hear. Your bank account is not shrinking because you lack income. It is shrinking because you spent years running a one-man popularity campaign, and popularity campaigns are expensive. Every dollar you have ever spent to avoid an awkward silence. Every discount you gave because you were afraid the client would think you were greedy. Every negotiation you lost because pushing back felt rude. Every family loan you never expected back, given not out of love, but out of fear being seen as the difficult one. All of it one long, quiet tax, the approval tax. And unlike an actual tax, nobody sends you a receipt. It just disappears month after month, year after year, and you call the resulting poverty bad luck. Here is the part that will sting. You have been trained since childhood to believe that being liked is the safest possible position in life. Teachers rewarded the agreeable child. Parents praise a child who did not cause trouble. Employers promote at least in the short run. Whoever nods along in meetings. So you build an entire identity engineer for approval. And you never once ask the only question that matters. Approval from whom, and at what cost? Machiavelli understood something the modern self-help industry refuses to say out loud. The crowd's affection is not loyalty. It is a mood. Moods change with the weather, with rumor, with the next person who tells them what they want to hear. You cannot build wealth on something that changes with the weather. You need something sturdier. You need respect, competence, boundaries, and the occasional willingness to be disliked by people who are never going to help you anyway. This is a courtier's curse. Not that they were evil or foolish or weak. They were simply optimizing for the wrong metric. They measured their worth in smiles received instead of leverage built. And so will you, unless you learn to see the difference, starting today. Consider Cesare Borgia, a man Machiavelli studied closely and admired for reasons that still unsettle modern readers. Borgia was not universally loved. He was, at times, thoroughly hated. But he was never poor, never powerless, and never at the mercy of a fickle crowd, because he built a position on structural advantage rather than emotional goodwill. When his enemies plotted against him, they did not do so because he had been unkind to them at dinner. They did so because he had become a genuine obstacle to their ambitions. And that is an entirely different, far more durable kind of relevance than being the most agreeable man in the room. Compare this to the fate of countless nameless courtiers whose entire biography, when historians bother to record at all, amounts to a single line. He was a favorite of the prince, until he was not. Their charm was real. Their intelligence was often considerable. Their downfall was identical every time, because charm without leverage is a candle in an open window, beautiful, warm, and entirely at the mercy of the next gust of wind. You do not need to become feared in the way a Renaissance warlord was feared. You need to understand the underlying mechanism he exploited, which has nothing to do with violence and everything to do with independence. The prince who did not need the crowd's love could not be controlled by threats to withdraw it. The person today who does not need every client's warmth, every family member's approval, or every stranger's good opinion cannot be controlled by the threat of losing it either. That is the entire game, and almost nobody is taught the rules. Chapter 1. The Approval Tax. Every time you choose comfort over clarity, you pay a tax nobody records anywhere except your future. Picture the negotiation you had last year. Maybe it was a salary conversation. Maybe it was a client asking for a lower rate. You felt the tension rise in your chest, the fear that if you held firm, they would think less of you, maybe even walk away. So you folded, not because their position was stronger, because your need to be seen as reasonable outweighed your need to be paid fairly. That gap between what you deserved and what you accepted has a name, and it compounds. It compounds in every negotiation after it. Because the version of you that folds once will fold again, and the people around you learn exactly how much pressure it takes to move you. Machiavelli warned that a ruler who is only trying to please will eventually please no one, because the moment you organize your decisions around being liked, you stop making decisions based on strategy. You start making decisions based on whoever is standing in front of you applying the most emotional pressure. That is not leadership. That is hostage negotiation, and you are the hostage. Here is a strategic reframe, the one the courtiers of history never learned in time. Every uncomfortable conversation you avoid does not disappear. It converts into a cost, and that cost is usually paid by your future self, with interest. The freelancer who is afraid to raise their rates is not being humble. They are quietly transferring their own income to a client who will never thank them for the discount, because the client does not know it was given out of fear. They simply think that is the market rate for you. Start tracking this immediately. Every time you feel the urge to lower a price, soften a boundary, or agree to something that costs you money purely to keep the peace, name it. Say it in your mind, plainly. This is the approval tax. Then ask yourself the only question that matters. Am I protecting a relationship, or am I protecting my own comfort? Those two things feel identical in the moment and are almost never the same thing. The people who build real wealth are not colder than you. They have simply stopped confusing being liked with being safe. There's a second, quieter form of the approval tax that almost nobody names, and it hides inside the word grateful. You take a job below your value and call yourself grateful for the opportunity. You accept a client who pays late and call yourself grateful for the work. Gratitude is a beautiful instinct when it is honest. It becomes a trap the moment it is used to disguise the fear of asking for what you are actually worth. Notice, this month, every time the word grateful appears in your mind immediately after a financial concession, and ask whether you are genuinely thankful or whether you are simply relieved that the discomfort of negotiating is over. Consider, 2, the strange asymmetry of this tax. When you fold under pressure to avoid seeming difficult, the other party rarely notices your restraint and almost never rewards it. They simply absorb the discount and move on to the next negotiation, where they will expect the same softness, because you have already taught them it exists. The approval tax is not a one-time payment. It is a subscription, silently renewed every time you allow the fear of one uncomfortable moment to outweigh the accumulated cost of 100 future ones. Chapter 2. The Mask of the Favorite. In every royal court, there was a figure known as a favorite. The courtier closest to the prince, showered with gifts, invited to every private dinner, whispered about with envy by everyone else in the palace. History remembers something brutal about these favorites. They fell the hardest, and they fell the fastest, because their entire position depended on one man's mood. You have a version of this in your own life, and it usually wears a friendlier face. It is the identity you have built around being the reliable one, the easy one, the one who never causes friction. It feels like safety. It is actually exposure, because the moment your usefulness or your agreeableness stops serving the person above you, whether that is a boss, a client, or even a friend, your position evaporates, and you never built anything underneath it to catch your fall. Machiavelli observed that the wise ruler builds power that does not depend on any single person's favor. Fortresses, alliances, skills that transfer, assets that produce independent of any one relationship. The favorite builds none of this, because building it requires moment of independence, moment of saying something the prince does not want to hear, and the favorite is too afraid of losing a smile to risk it. Ask yourself honestly where in your financial life you are playing the favorite. Perhaps it is a job where you have made yourself indispensable to one manager instead of building a skill set that would make you valuable anywhere. Perhaps it is a business relationship where you have given away your leverage in exchange for being seen as easygoing, low maintenance, a joy to work with. That reputation feels wonderful until the day the relationship changes, and you discover you built no foundation of your own beneath it. The correction is not to become difficult for its own sake. It is to build sources of value that do not require anyone's ongoing approval to exist. A skill you could sell to 10 different buyers. A reputation built on results instead of pleasantness. Savings that do not depend on staying likable to a single employer. The moment your financial position depends on being liked by one specific person, you have handed them a leash, and leashes historically are never held gently forever. There's a reason the most secure people you know rarely seem desperate to be everyone's favorite. It is not arrogance. It is arithmetic. A person with 3 income streams, 5 valuable skills, and a reputation built on delivered results does not need any single relationship to remain warm, because no single relationship holds enough of their total position to matter if it cools. The favorite, by contrast, has placed nearly all their weight on one relationship, one manager, one client, one benefactor, and every ounce of their charm exists to keep that single structure standing. Diversification is not only a financial strategy for your portfolio, it is a survival strategy for your dignity. There is a simple diagnostic question you can ask right now. If the one relationship your income depends on most heavily ended tomorrow, without warning, how many months could you survive before real damage set in? If the honest answer makes you uncomfortable, you're just located exactly where the mask of the favorite is currently hanging on you, and exactly where your next act of independence needs to be aimed. Chapter 3. The Cost of Yes. There is a particular kind of poverty that has nothing to do with income. It is the poverty of the person who cannot say no, and it is one of the most expensive conditions a human being can carry. Every yes you give away out of fear costs something. The friend you lent money to because refusing felt cruel. The family gathering you funded because declining felt selfish. The extra hours you worked unpaid because setting a boundary felt ungrateful. None of these were generosity. Generosity is a choice made from strength. This was fear wearing generosity's clothing, and fear-based giving never builds respect. It quietly builds resentment on both sides, because you gave what you cannot afford, and they took what they never earned. Machiavelli wrote that men are so simple and so subject to present necessities that a deceiver will always find someone willing to be deceived. Read that again, but replace the word deceiver with the word request. Someone will always ask. Someone will always need. Someone will always frame their need as your moral obligation. The world is full of open hands, and if you do not build a muscle to say no, every single one of them will find you eventually, because desperate people can smell an inability to refuse from across a room. Here is what nobody tells you about the word no. It is not cruelty. It is architecture. Every no you speak from clarity, rather than spite, becomes a wall that protects the resources you're trying to build. Every yes you give from fear becomes a hole in that wall, and holes do not stay small. They widen because people learn where the weak points are and they return to them. Practice this immediately in the smallest interactions first. When you feel the automatic yes rising in your throat, pause for 3 full seconds before answering. In that silence, ask a single question. Am I saying yes because I want to, or because saying no feels unbearable? If it is the second, you already know your answer, and giving it will feel uncomfortable exactly once. Refusing to give it will cost you for years. There's an old pattern worth naming here, one that repeats in nearly every family and every friend group. The person who cannot say no eventually becomes a person everyone quietly relies on to say yes. This is not an accident, and it is not a compliment. It is a role, assigned to you slowly, over years, by people who notice how reliably you folded and simply stop asking anyone else. The tragedy is that this role often gets mistaken for being needed, when in reality it is closer to being used. Being needed involves reciprocity. Being used only involves convenience. Learn to tell the difference before the role calcifies into your entire identity, because roles like this one rarely get renegotiated. They usually have to be broken. Breaking it does not require a speech, an ultimatum, or a dramatic confrontation. It requires one refusal, delivered calmly, followed by silence instead of an apology. Watch what happens next. Some relationships will adjust within days, because the person asking never actually needed what they were requesting. They simply took it because it was offered without resistance. Others will reveal themselves more clearly than any conversation ever could, and that clarity, however unwelcome, is worth more than another year of comfortable, expensive silence. Chapter 4. The Illusion of Consensus. Somewhere along the way, you began outsourcing your financial decisions to an invisible jury. What will they think if I invest in this? What will they say if I cut this expense? What will people assume if I live below the lifestyle they expect from me? You have never met most members of this jury. You have built your entire financial strategy around their imagined verdict. This is what Machiavelli called the danger of ruling by the opinion of the crowd rather than by clear-eyed strategy. The crowd, he observed, is inconsistent, easily swayed, and ultimately indifferent to your long-term outcome. They will admire your new car for exactly as long as it takes them to forget about it, and they will not remember your name when the loan payment is due. Consider how many financial decisions in your life were made not for your benefit, but for the approval of an audience that was barely paying attention. The wedding that cost more than the down payment on a home, because a smaller version might have looked cheap. The car that stretched the budget, because arriving anywhere in something modest felt like an admission of failure. The vacation posted for validation, funded by a credit card quietly charging interest in the background. Every one of these decisions was made in a courtroom with no judge, defending a case nobody was actually prosecuting. The wealthy operate by a different rule, one that feels almost rude the first time you hear it. Their financial decisions are private until the results are undeniable. They do not seek consensus before acting, because consensus is slow, cowardly, and almost always wrong about anything unconventional. Every meaningful advantage in history was unpopular before it was obvious. The person who invested when everyone else mocked them, the person who left a secure job everyone envied to build something uncertain. They were disliked briefly by people whose opinions stopped matching the moment the results arrived. Start making one financial decision this month without asking anyone's opinion first. Not because other people are useless, but because you need to remember what it feels like to trust your own judgment more than an imagined jury that was never going to pay your bills anyway. Notice, too, how selective this invisible jury actually is. It never shows up to admire your restraint. Nobody applauds a year you quietly paid down debt instead of upgrading your car. The jury only convenes when there is spectacle to judge, and spectacle is expensive by definition. This is precisely why the wealthiest people you will ever study built their fortunes during years that looked, from the outside, almost boring. Boring does not trend. Boring does not earn compliments at dinner. Boring simply compounds, quietly, while the jury is busy admiring someone else's rented lifestyle. There is a private freedom in this that almost nobody describes accurately. It is not the freedom of having more money, though that eventually follows. It is the freedom of no longer performing your finances for an audience, of making a decision and simply living inside its consequences without narrating to anyone. That silence, once you experience it, becomes addictive in the healthiest possible sense, because you finally notice how much energy you use to spend managing an audience that was never actually watching as closely as you feared. Chapter 5, The Silent Blade. There comes a point in every serious pursuit of freedom where you must cut something, and it is rarely money. It is people, obligations, and identities that only survive because you have never had the discipline to end them. This is the most uncomfortable chapter. So let us not soften it. Some of your relationships exist purely as financial arrangements disguised as friendship. The friend who only calls when they need something. The family member whose love seems to correlate suspiciously with your generosity. The social circle that requires a certain spending level simply to remain a member in good standing. You have kept these connections alive not because they enrich you, but because ending them feels like an admission that the relationship was never quite real to begin with. Machiavelli was unsentimental about this exact problem. He noted that a wise ruler does not maintain alliances that become liabilities simply out of old loyalty or discomfort with change. Sentimentality, he understood, is a luxury only the secure can afford, and even then, it is dangerous when it blinds you to what a relationship is actually costing you. This does not mean becoming cold or transactional with everyone in your life. It means being honest, finally, about which relationships you are financing out of fear of the silence that would follow their ending. Ask yourself which single expense in your life exists purely to maintain an image for people who would not notice, and would certainly not reciprocate. If the money stopped flowing tomorrow, the cut does not need to be dramatic. It rarely should be. It needs to be quiet, deliberate, and final. Reduce the spending tied to relationships that only respond to spending. Watch carefully who remains. The ones who stay were never buying your affection with your own money in the first place. The ones who disappear were never your allies. They were creditors you had not yet recognized. There is a specific grief that comes with this discovery, and it deserves to be acknowledged rather than rushed past. Realizing that a relationship you valued was, at least in part, a financial arrangement dressed up in warmer language, is genuinely painful. It is tempting to avoid this realization entirely, to keep paying the invoice indefinitely rather than confront what it means about the relationship's true foundation. Resist that temptation. The pain of seeing clearly once is smaller and shorter than the accumulated cost of pretending not to see for another decade. Machiavelli did not ask his prince to enjoy cutting a bad alliance. He asked him to do it anyway, because the alternative was slow ruin disguised as loyalty. The strange comfort waiting on the other side of this cut is one you cannot fully anticipate until you have made it. The energy once spent maintaining an arrangement that only worked in one direction does not simply vanish. It returns to you, and you will find it reappearing in places you had quietly neglected for years. Your own savings, your own skills, your own genuine friendships that never once required a financial performance to survive. Chapter 6, The Feared Ledger. There is a specific kind of respect that money cannot buy and approval-seeking actively destroys, and it is a respect that comes from being predictably, calmly firm. Think about the people in your life who never chase approval, and notice something curious about how you treat them. You do not take advantage of them. You do not ask them for favors you suspect they will refuse. You do not negotiate hard against them, because some quiet part of you already senses it will not work. This is not because they are unkind. It is because they have built what Machiavelli called reputation that precedes them into every room. one where the outcome of pushing against their boundaries is already known before anyone bothers to try. This is the entire secret behind why certain people never seem to get taken advantage of financially, while others bleed money in every direction. It is not intelligence. It is not even wealth. It is a track record of holding a position, even when holding it felt uncomfortable. Every time you cave under social pressure, you teach the world that pressure works on you. And the world remembers lessons like that far longer than it remembers your kindness. Building what we might call a feared ledger does not mean intimidating people. It means becoming known, quietly and consistently, as someone whose no means no, whose price is a price, and whose boundaries do not move under the weight of someone else's disappointment. This reputation takes time to build and seconds to destroy, which is exactly why so few people ever commit to it. It requires tolerating short-term discomfort, the awkward silence after a firm answer, the mild social cost of disappointing someone, in exchange for a long-term position that very few people will ever bother testing again. Begin building this ledger with the smallest interactions. The next time someone asks for a discount, a favor, or an exception you do not actually want to give, hold the position to the discomfort instead of collapsing to end the tension. The discomfort passes in minutes. The precedent lasts for years. There is a particular kind of calm you will notice in people who have done this work for a long time. They do not raise their voice to hold a boundary because they no longer need volume to signal seriousness. Their history has already done the signaling for them. This is the final form of the feared ledger, not intimidation, but a kind of quiet gravity that makes other people naturally careful around your time, your terms, and your money without you ever needing to explain why. You will know this ledger is finally working when the requests themselves begin to change shape. People stop asking for the discount they suspect you will refuse. They stop testing boundaries they have already learned will hold. This is not because they like you less. In most cases, they respect you considerably more because certainty, even inconvenient certainty, is something the human mind quietly prefers over the exhausting uncertainty of someone who might fold if pushed hard enough. Chapter 7. The Sovereign Standard. Everything before this chapter was preparation for the only shift that actually matters. At some point, you must stop measuring your worth by the temperature of the room around you. The final and most dangerous stage of the approval addiction is not caring what one person thinks. It is needing the general, ambient approval of everyone, all the time, an invisible audience whose applause you have organized your entire financial life around earning. Machiavelli's final and hardest lesson was this: the ruler who seeks to satisfy everyone rules no one, least of all himself. A sovereign, in the truest sense, is not someone with a crown. It is someone whose decisions are no longer negotiable based on the emotional weather of the people around them. Sovereignty means your budget is not a democracy. Your financial boundaries are not up for a vote among people who have never once considered your long-term security when asking you for something. Sovereignty means the discomfort being briefly disliked to stop registering as a threat, because you have finally understood that the people whose approval costs you the most are rarely the people who would help you if the money ran out. This is not a call to isolation. It is a call to selectivity. Reserve your need for approval for the small circle of people who have actually earned the right to influence your decisions through demonstrated loyalty, not proximity or volume. Everyone else, the crowd, the acquaintances, the distant relatives with opinions about your spending, the strangers online, the sharp-tongued cousin at every family dinner, their approval was never a currency you could spend anywhere that mattered. The sovereign standard is simple to state and difficult to live. Would I make this decision if no one was watching, and no one would ever find out how I chose? If the answer changes when the audience disappears, you were never making a financial decision. You were performing one, and performances, however convincing, do not pay your bills. There's a final test worth applying to every major decision from this point forward, and it is uncomfortable precisely because it is so clarifying. Imagine the decision has already been made, the outcome already known, and picture the small handful of people whose reaction would genuinely matter to you. Not the crowd, not the acquaintances, the 2 or 3 people who have actually earned a voice in your life through years of demonstrated loyalty. If those specific people would understand or even respect the choice you are making, you have your answer, regardless of what the wider audience assumes or whispers. Sovereignty was never about needing no one. It was about finally being precise, after a lifetime of being generic, about whose opinion was ever worth the price you were paying for it. The courtiers of history believed, until the very end, that being loved by the right people was the same thing as being secure. They learned, usually too late, that love without leverage is simply a longer, more elegant path to ruin. You have spent years, perhaps your entire life, running the same experiment they ran, hoping that enough agreeableness, enough likability, enough smoothing over of every uncomfortable edge would eventually add up to safety. It never does. It adds up to an invoice, quietly delivered in the form of a bank account that never quite grows the way it should, and a nagging sense that you are working hard for outcomes that somehow belong to everyone except you. Nothing in this video asked you to become cruel. Cruelty was never the alternative to weakness. Clarity was. The Prince Machiavelli study did not need to be hated. He needed to be respected enough that his boundaries were never casually tested, and that respect, once built, freed him from the exhausting daily labor of managing everyone's opinion of him. You can build the same thing, starting today, in rooms far smaller than any royal court, in the negotiation you have been avoiding, in the friend you have been financing, in the yes you have been giving out of fear instead of choice. Every one of these moments is an opportunity to lay one brick of foundation that does not depend on anyone's mood, anyone's smile, or anyone's temporary affection. The courtier's curse was never really about being too kind. It was about building a life that could be taken from you the moment someone else's feelings changed. Build something sturdier. Build a life that stands on its own foundation, whether or not the room happens to like you today. Somewhere tonight, someone will ask you for something you do not want to give, and the old instinct will rise, familiar, comfortable, exhausting. It will tell you that peace is worth more than principle, that one more concession will not matter, that the invoice can wait one more month. It has always waited. That is precisely how it grew so large without you noticing. The next time that instinct rises, do not silence it with force. Simply ask it the one question it has never had to answer before. Whose approval is this? And what has it ever actually given me in return? The crown was never the reward for being loved. It was a reward for no longer needing to be.